We have a lot to cover this week, so I'm going to try to get through it all. This chapter in the book discusses different ways that people conceive of their social relationships in different types of societies. Most societies define groups and the behavior appropriate between or among them. So when we look at kinship, we define groups of relatives who we will rely on for personal or economic support, and our relationship to people inside or outside our kin group may influence our behavior towards them. We're going to discuss this more next week. As we already discussed a little bit with gender, we define ourselves, our behavior, and our interactions with others according to gender categories. The book discusses some of the differences in communication and status between men and women. This week's chapter defines some of the other key elements of group formation and interaction in terms of power relationships among people. Social classes, or the lack of them, define who people are in a society and what their interactions will be with other people. I like the three-part breakdown of power, wealth, and prestige as a good way to consider relationships. I'm going to talk about these a little bit more, and I want you to remember as you read and listen that these are not always found together. For example, among the Pueblo Indians of the American Southwest, power and prestige are not based on wealth, but on control of various parts of the ritual cycle. Wealth actually decreases a person's prestige. In England in the 1800s, prestige came from birth and title rather than wealth, so middle-class people who became wealthy still had less social standing than members of the nobility who became poor. That's why it's important to consider the context of a society. So here's a list of some of the concepts to know from this part of the book, and I'm going to expand a little bit on some of them and not necessarily on all of them. So let's start with social organization. When we look at social structure, we're talking about the distribution of roles and groupings that direct how people interact with each other. This includes the social categories, positions, and roles within a group. All groups have to organize so they can interact productively. Social structures affected by demographic factors, population size and density challenge and society's internal cohesion. So the bigger the group, the more complex the social interactions. A social role is the most basic part of the social structure. It's a behavioral category defined by the social system. You can have many at once. It directs how people interact with each other. There are two characteristics of these social roles. The first is the role aspects. These are the rights and obligations associated with the role. So when you think about aspects, think about the responsibility that you have in that role. Think about the rules about how you are supposed to act in that role. Contemplate one of the social roles you have and think about how you're supposed to act. So for instance, as a student, what are your obligations as a student? How are you supposed to act? The second characteristic of a social role is attributes. That refers to the behavior appropriate for the rules of the role. So it refers to how you actually act, and it relates back to the aspects. So as a student, how do all those rules play out as you go about your role? Next, there are two primary types of social roles. The first is ascribed. That essentially means that the world is predefined for the individual. It's based on birth. It happens at birth. So sex, age, ethnic background, for instance. What else can you think of? Achieved social roles are assumed based on the individual's initiative. For instance, professional training can lead to socialization into new types of social roles. Other kinds of achieved social roles are the role of driver, college student, and so on. These types are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and social roles may contain aspects of both. So we have rules for behavior and social roles, and there are types of roles. There are no simple rules here. Everyone incorporates a variety of social roles, and social status refers to the relative importance we place on those social roles. And there are four primary types of status. Your book really talks about prestige, wealth, and power, and I'm going to just add authority into that. So prestige is based on social honor or esteem. Wealth is based on accumulated material resources. Many social scientists believe that wealth is the most important aspect of social stratification. There are obvious ways that wealth can translate into power. Rich men and women are more likely to run for political office and win than others, and wealthy capitalists can influence government in ways that are in their own self-interests. Power is based on the ability to influence or control others' behavior. Another way of defining power is as control of access to or influence over others' behavior. So anything anyone wants, needs, or think they need, someone with power can control access to or influence their access to. Donald Trump had power before he was elected president. Because he is wealthy, he could control or influence other behavior. Authority, on the other hand, is legitimate power invested in designated roles. This is power used with the consent of members of a society. From an anthropological viewpoint, we are interested in knowing who has the power in a society and through what channel it is exercised. We are also interested in knowing what its sources are. Status is an incredibly important influence in human behavior, and the relative emphasis on status varies from group to group. So the definitions I just gave you are ways of thinking about social structure. Now we can talk about social stratification and define it more clearly. So when we talk about stratification, this essentially refers to the hierarchical distribution of prestige, wealth, and power. Status like this can operate on a group level as well as an individual level. There are two primary ways of viewing the stratification of a society. First, we can define a society as egalitarian. That means everyone in the society is considered of equal worth. Social distinctions are made by the recognition of individual achievement, such as these hunter-gatherers in the upper right-hand corner. Second, there are stratified societies. In these societies, there are structured class differences of individuals and groups. Stratification is based on social status, and it can be ascribed, meaning that you're born with it, such as the royalty of England, or it can be achieved, meaning the status is gained or achieved. It can also be based on power, wealth, or prestige. Put Michael Phelps on here because he has certainly achieved status, prestige, he has some power, and he definitely has some wealth now. There are different ways societies stratify themselves, or more simply, the way they divide themselves. So let's start with age. Age divides the continuum of life. Think about the different access you get as you age. When you are 16, you get to drive. When you are 18, you get to vote and be drafted. When you are 21, you get to drink and go into a pot shop. When you are 25, you can rent a car, and so on and so forth. Gender, especially male and female roles, these often come with different standards of behavior. These are culturally constructed. As you've discovered, there can be more than two accepted genders depending on the society. And we can talk about class societies. This refers to the open status ranking of social groups, and it's how our society is based. In class societies, there are ranked social roles, and in theory, individuals achieve those roles. Social mobility is open in class societies, and it is possible to move up and down the status ladder. The United States is said to have an open class system. This is a part of our mythology and is based on the democratic principle of equality and opportunity for all. Many people in the U.S. find it difficult to accept the evidence that this equality has not yet been fully realized. Subcultural behavior patterns are often associated with classes. Anthropological research indicates that social classes are much more than an economic phenomenon. The social class is also a subculture. The members of a social class share similar life experiences, occupational goals, values, educational background, leisure activities, buying habits, and political views, and so much more. Another way to look at social class that brings economic factors and power into sharper focus is to examine the differences in life chances among social classes. Life chances refer to an individual's opportunity to fulfill or fail to fulfill his or her life potential in society. An individual's life chances include opportunities to obtain an education. This education is supposed to help us maximize intellectual and creative potential. Opportunities to participate in associations and cultural life. Opportunities to live in comfort or security. An individual's life chances are linked to his or her position in the stratification system. The relationship between life chances and social mobility does not really uphold the American myth of equality. Individuals born into positions of wealth, high status, and power strive to maintain those positions and frequently have the means for keeping others from achieving mobility. People born into the middle class have a better chance of improving their life chances than people born into a poorer class. Low social positions in our society tend to negate not only one's chances, but also those of one's children. We have an expression in our society that essentially goes, "It's who you know, not what you know that counts." This suggests that we are aware of a contradiction between our ideal and the actual way the class system is played out. An anthropologist, Jack Weatherford, has studied U.S. Congress. This book is called Tribes on the Hill, and he suggests in this book that it is kinship connections that often determine who get to play the game in Congress. In contrast to class systems, which are primarily or supposedly based on achieved statuses, the second type of stratified society is called the caste system and is based on birth. Your book covers this pretty well, so I'm not going to go over it here, so we can talk about race and ethnicity. These are two final categories we are considering in social stratification. Race and ethnicity are major factors in how people create groups, understand their own identity, and position in society. Race is a categorization of people based on a perception of real biological difference. While biological difference does exist, the idea that there are clear-cut categories into which you can fit people is a cultural idea based on the limited geographic knowledge that people have. For example, we perceive that blacks and whites have distinctive ranges of skin color. This view is based on a history in which African slaves were imported into populations of people from Northern Europe. The Northern Europeans are very light-skinned, while the Africans came from a region with much darker skin, and so the accepted knowledge became an expectation of discrete differences. However, if a sample was taken of skin colors from Northern Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, North Africa, and so on, continuing south in a steady sweep, there would be no clear break between light skin and dark skin, nowhere to clearly draw a line between white and black, but a continuum of variation. Thus, the idea of discrete categories is based more on historical circumstances than global realities. Races have always been mixed, and this also prevents discrete categories from existing because many traits become blended. For example, the darker-skinned, dark-haired people of Mexico and Central America that often get called Hispanic or Latinos, is this a race? The biological features come from a mixture of European and American Indian groups, but they have been blended for several hundred years. Is this a race, or should they be considered white or Indian, and if so, which? In the 2000 census, the government removed Hispanic from the race category, expecting Hispanics to define themselves as white and record Hispanic as their ethnicity. Over 20% of Hispanics check the other box for race because they don't consider themselves white. This gets into another issue, which is how we use the terms in society. We have two terms, race, which is perceived as being biological, and ethnicity, which is perceived as being cultural, but we are fairly inconsistent in how we apply the term. If you look at how people use the terms, there's a lot of confusion. Historically, the concept of race has been applied to create more of a perception of distance between people. For example, Jewish has been defined as race at various times and in places where Jews are highly discriminated against, while has been considered an ethnicity in areas where there is less discrimination. The perception of Arabs and Middle Easterners as separate race from Europeans has increased since the onset of violence and conflict in the Middle East. All of these factors make race a concept that's difficult to use scientifically, but a very interesting cultural phenomenon to study. It has been used to create categories of prestige or privilege, to discriminate or stigmatize, to justify genocide, and to create national, ethnic, or personal pride. So social hierarchies in different societies vary along several dimensions, such as the criteria used to differentiate people into one level of society or another, and the kinds of privileges attached to people at different levels, and so on. In America, people are primarily separated into social classes by income and personal possessions. Race and ethnicity seem to play a part in this. There are few, if any, modern nations in which one portion of the population does not in some way enjoy privileges that other portions do not share. In most cases, this inequality follows from the assumption that people are somehow better than others. Some people believe that this hierarchical ordering is unavoidable. and others suggest this is avoidable and counter to human nature. So what do you think?